Welcome along. It's a Red Star Radio special today, this time with moving pictures. And joining me today is Joti Brar, who's here to talk to us about the recent conference of the World Anti-imperialist Project, which has been held in Caracas, Venezuela. And a lot of interesting things came out of that, a lot of interesting things to discuss. So, Joti, welcome back along, this time with imagery.
Thanks very much, Alex. Much appreciated.
And I want to start out with what I've just mentioned, which is that obviously Venezuela is a country which has been subjected to a long-term, almost generation-long campaign from the imperialists, stretching from the days of Hugo Chavez and the infamous failed coup that was staged against him over 20 years ago now, and how the resistance of the masses in Venezuela defeated that coup and brought him back to power. But we've had now 20 years of internal subversion from the comprador bourgeoisie in Venezuela, external sanctions and coup attempts from U.S. imperialism and its allies in the region, including the failed wannabe Bonaparte of Brazil, Bolsonaro. So, as somebody who's just been there to Caracas for this conference, what were your impressions of Venezuela after being held under these sanctions and this imperialist campaign for so long?
Thanks, Alex. Well, you're really right to pinpoint those kind of key things, that it has actually been a generation now that's grown up under the Bolivarian process. And that despite all the efforts of outside and inside agents, they haven't been able to unseat the popular anti-imperialist government there. So that's had a huge impact on society in several different ways, some of them really, really positive, some of them obviously creating a lot of hardship, but very, very interesting to see that process. Now, our conference, the World Anti-imperialist Platform conference, took place in Caracas as the kind of center of revolutionary anti-imperialist activity in Latin America. So that was one aspect of what we were doing, but it was timed to coincide with a whole load of celebrations that were happening at the same time. Lots of events were happening simultaneously across that weekend because it was the 10th anniversary of the passing of Hugo Chavez, who of course was the founder and the kind of spiritual leader, theoretical founder of the Bolivarian process of the PSUV, of everything that's been, the whole anti-imperialist, pro-socialist movement in Venezuela. He was the founder and the ideological leader of all of that, and very much still kind of seen as the father of the nation by the masses. I mean, his, paintings of him are everywhere. His slogans are everywhere. His sentiment towards socialism and against imperialism is deeply imbued in the masses, and it's really fascinating to see that, what a mass movement really looks like. We talk about imperialism in our country, but as people who've grown up in an imperialist country, for most British workers, imperialism, well, for most British workers, imperialism is not even a word. But for those for whom it is a word and a concept, it's quite an abstract one, because the coalface, the sharp end of imperialism, is elsewhere. And we are encouraged to think of anti-imperialism as a kind of a charitable kind of feeling of, it would be nicer if our rulers were nicer to people elsewhere, or we feel sorry for them because they're victims. But the real understanding of the struggle against imperialism being a kind of vital aspect of our fight for liberation and for socialism is not something a lot of British people really understand. And certainly experientially, it's hard for them to understand, because they've grown up with in a different environment with a whole lot of prejudices about the fact that people in the rest of the world are poor because they're a little bit useless, and not really able to organize themselves or build things or develop technology, or they're just not really up to it. That essentially, that's the imperialist propaganda we've all grown up with for like 150 years. So it's quite deep in our culture, and to go somewhere where the mass movement for socialism and against imperialism is a real mass movement, a popular mass movement with its roots deep in the poor masses, there are certain things you see. One is that on the working class level, if you go to a working class area and meet with the local leaders and local representatives of the local level councils and communes, they are overwhelmingly women. And this you see all over Latin America, and you see anywhere where a movement is really a mass movement, that the roots of the movement are working class women, because they're the foundation of all communal and family life on the grassroots local level. So to see that really makes you understand that what a mass movement really looks like, and how sort of culturally different it feels when it's embedded in the community like that. So there's something very inspiring for an anti-imperialist from the West to go to a country where anti-imperialism is a big mass movement and see that it's full of, you know, ordinary, everyday working class people, working mothers, grandmothers, you know, university students, little kids, you know, and everything in between. Of course, you know, lots of men, but it's very noticeable. You know, we're used to the left-wing movement here having deteriorated from its former mass base, becomes something that's a bit of a sideline activity for a certain type of male, right? And then it can be hard to bring women into the atmosphere because it looks like a boys' club. But for it to be a meaningful movement, women have to be involved, and will inevitably, as the struggle develops, be drawn in. So it's kind of in both directions. Women are going to play a big role. But that's very exciting and a positive thing to see and be part of. Something else that you see is the way that the slogans of socialism and anti-imperialism are truly popular. So, you know, you go to a meeting and someone gives their little speech telling you about their daily life or something they've achieved in the commune that they're excited about, and then they'll end with a slogan. One of the popular slogans, you know, socialism or death, or, you know, Viva Hugo, or death to imperialism. And it's immediately taken up in a really spontaneous and popular and unrehearsed way by a whole load of people. And then it will go on as a chant. You know, it won't just happen once. It will go on, you know, lots of times in a kind of, you know, uplifting, engaged way. A whole load of people start chanting, and then another chant, someone will do another chant and everyone will join in, and then maybe someone will start a song and everyone will join in, right? And so this way that the slogans, the popular slogans which sum up the struggle, are embedded into the culture of the people, so that little kids join in, and men and women of all ages will start and join in with, you know, slogan chanting. I mean, I saw it even in a theatre. I went to a theatre performance, and it was a special show, and the president came to the same showing that I went to, and it was a kind of cultural performance of all kinds of, you know, different singers and dancers showing Venezuelan popular culture, and in a tribute to Hugo Chavez, because obviously it was all part of this weekend. And the audience, you know, was waiting for the president to arrive, and so we were waiting for quite a while before the performance started. And you know, they're just chatting and doing what audiences do. But every now and again, a bit of the audience would pop up and start waving flags and slapping slogans, and then it would kind of spread around the auditorium. And, you know, it's a bit like a football chant, right? You know, the way that those, or I don't know if you've ever been to a rave, you know, someone could yell and then it goes around the room. You know, the way that something that is really felt by people just spreads and is infectious because people feel it and believe it. That's something very interesting to see, and to understand how, you know, 2.5 decades of really fighting imperialism, really on the front line, you know, really, really feeling that imperialism is trying to crush you and to subvert your will and decapitate your leadership and, you know, take over your army and all of those things, you know, and crush you with hunger and despair out of trying to fight for your liberation and stand up for the things that you have won already. And that understanding is really, really strong and really deep. And it really accounts for the mass following that the PSUV has in Venezuela, despite all the difficulties. If you want, I can talk a bit about the, you know, some of the difficulties and the polarization.
Well, yes, I think it's it's important to understand the difficulties that the revolutionary process in Venezuela has faced going over 20 years now, and how the masses have responded to that at each stage. Because without the support of the masses in Venezuela, then the PSUV would have been overthrown a long time ago, going all right the way back to that attempted coup 21 years ago in 2002, all the way through the employers' lockouts in the oil industry, and also the hardships that the sanctions regime has put in place, together with the sabotage of the capitalist class in Venezuela themselves. So if you can talk a bit about that, Joti, that'd be really useful.
Definitely. Well, it's interesting because I was in Caracas twice before. The last time was literally just before lockdown. I'm pretty sure. I think it was January 2020, and I think I was there again in the year before that, 2019. So it was interesting to me to feel the difference in the atmosphere amongst the people generally, delegates who I met, and there's sense that I got of the place I was in. Now it's just an impression, but I did talk to a few people, and I asked them, look, this is my impression. What do you think about that? And all the people who I asked that, they agreed. They felt that that impression was a good reflection of the reality. So, you know, bearing in mind it's not in any way scientific or based on great research, what I found was that between 2019 and 2023, there's been a real shift in the mood and the feeling. Although the difficulties haven't really lightened since 2019, there's a sense that we have endured and the difficulties are going to lighten for several reasons. So if you look at the process, you know, right back from 1999 all the way up to kind of now, but, you know, up to COVID in particular, and the way that that was used, and all of the, you know, the coup attempts and the sabotage attempts and the, you know, attempts to launch, you know, incursions, military incursions, and attempts to assassinate the president, both presidents. And there's a strong belief amongst people that, in fact, Hugo Chavez probably was assassinated in some kind of slow-moving way, that his cancer was a bit mysterious. But anyway, whether or not that's true, there were certainly many other attempts on his life, and there have been many attempts on the life of Maduro. But one of the things I think the Venezuelan people really feel, and one of the reasons they have so much love and respect for Chavez in particular, is not only that he was a man of the people, he loved the people, he gave everything to the people, and it was obvious that he did. You know, he had nothing for himself. He was no kind of careerist. Everything about his life was how to serve the people and how to help the people and how to represent the people and how to help them to fight imperialism. And he was very selfless in that sense and very dedicated to that mission. Then there's the fact that, you know, across Latin America, there have been movements and leaders who promised to lead and fulfill that fight against imperialism, but in various ways have been displaced. So it might be assassination, it might be coups, it might be exile, it could be all kinds of different ways, but in whatever way, those movements have been subverted, decapitated, crushed, and the people have been disappointed. And there was a sense from the Venezuelans, a kind of a pride in Hugo Chavez, that everything that was thrown at him didn't move him. You know, he defeated that coup in 2002 and came back. He didn't go off into exile and just accept it. You know, that coup was defeated by the people, but by Chavez himself and the way that he behaved. And after that, there was a definite change of direction in terms of the Chavez understood that he couldn't rely on any of the oligarchic families to be stable allies against US imperialism, because they were more worried about the masses. Even the ones who were sort of had a kind of national inclination, they weren't good allies. So he very much steered himself toward basing the process in the masses and explicitly saying, we're going to have to go for socialism then. Right? It will have to be socialism because that's the only way that we're going to get liberation. Now, it's interesting because Hugo Chavez was not a scientific socialist. He does not got a kind of big foundation in Marxism or training in Marxism, Leninism. But, you know, he certainly read and was influenced by, key imperialist, Lenin's imperialism and, the Communist Manifesto and certain of those key texts. I mean, he even read them on, they set up that sort of hour show that he used to do on a Sunday, or 2-hour show, whatever. He used to read those works to the people, and talk to them about the fight against imperialism. So a whole generation grew up watching his show on a Sunday and listening to the things he said about socialism and about imperialism, and really feeling that he was their leader, their teacher, their father, the person who really cared about them. So there's a very, very deep sense for the Venezuelan people that Hugo Chavez is still with them in all of his teachings and in the spirit that he gave to that movement. And it's really my sense when I was in Venezuela in 2019 was, my gosh, it's only spirit that's holding these people together. They were suffering so much from the sanctions. It was making life really, really grindingly difficult. And they had the problem that, the Venezuelan PSUV, they have come to power through bourgeois elections to run a bourgeois state machine. They haven't had a revolution that smashes the old state machine and builds a new one. So the majority of the media is in the hands of their enemies. That creates a great polarization in Venezuelan society, and it's a massive impediment to their ability to, proceed. They can't do a planned economy, which when you're up against sanctions makes things really, really hard. The mass of the means of production are in the hands of the capitalist class still, most of whom are hostile to or many of whom are hostile to the government. Then, the other positions within the civil service and the judiciary and the parliament, the old parliament. Now, I get muddled up with the names, the Constituent Assembly and National Assembly. I think the National Assembly is the old parliament, and that is basically still a bulwark of the old bourgeois power, or it's kind of very split anyway, and not particularly useful to the PSUV and to the Bolivarian project. So they're fighting internal as well as external, and of course they've had the sanctions and this huge pressure from outside to try to depose them, which has been relentless, for like 2 decades. The seizure of so many of their assets, the seizure of their oil assets in the USA, which were huge, refineries and all sorts, seizure of their gold in the Bank of England, seizure of any kind of assets abroad. That's really, beggared the government in terms of paying for things and doing things. And they've had to find a lot of ways around, right? In the early days, before the sanctions regime, Chavez gained huge popularity by basically rediverting the country's oil wealth towards popular programs of all kinds. So huge program of building social housing, huge program of education, of healthcare, of all of the basic things that really matter to ordinary people. That kind of came grinding to a halt with the sanctions regime. And the more sanctions they pile on, the harder it becomes for the Venezuelans to do any of the things they really want to do. Nevertheless, they're trying to empower the people, right? So in 2019, when I was there, I had this sense of like, they're pushing ahead the best they can in this really difficult situation against external and internal enemies. But it felt like the thing that held them together was this tremendous spirit they have, and they really, they themselves feel like they owe that to Chavez, that he inspired them to have and hold on to that spirit despite all the troubles. What I found this time around when I went was, yes, you still feel in some respect like it's held together with spirit, but the fact that they've come through everything that the imperialists threw at them, through the sanctions for so many years, through the pandemic, which was weaponized, as we know, everywhere in the third world, and particularly in countries that have governments that the imperialists don't like. They've gone very big on trying to weaponize COVID to bring down governments they're hostile to. So that was definitely done in Venezuela. They were denied vaccines, even that they'd paid for. They were stopped from having help. So, but as this new multipolar world is emerging, Venezuela's isolation is coming to an end. And even though the signs of that are not very great yet, there's a sense, I think, of rising optimism that it's in the post. In all directions, stronger links with China, with Russia, with Iran, which is very important because, of course, Iran has got a lot of the things Venezuela needs, and it's an oil importing and processing nation. So there's a lot of exchange of goods and technologies that can go on there, and expertise, as is Russia, of course. But this whole thing, being able to get infrastructural help from China, as so many countries are doing, being able to start to get military help from Russia, as so many countries are also doing, this is a new formula that's liberating or helping countries to sense their liberation in many, many places. But, Venezuela, they tried to isolate Venezuela for so long. And for so long, Venezuela just basically had Cuba as its friend. But over the last, 5-10 years, that has been slowly undermined by the fact that the overuse of the sanctions weapon by the USA and its allies has basically meant that more and more countries, more and more bigger and bigger countries, more important countries economically and militarily, are looking for other ways, other partners, ways around the US banking system and the US dollar and all the rest of it. And it's now not only Venezuela that's going, we've got to find another way to trade with each other. There's like a massive load of really important countries who are doing it. So there's a sense amongst the Venezuelans that I saw that although in many ways the stalemate inside the country is almost still existing, there's a sense that in the post is a boost to the forces of anti-imperialism and socialism, that they're just kind of holding out for and feeling like it's on the way and things are about to, we're going to start to see things really shift soon. And I could sort of feel that. I could also feel that there, my physical experience was I didn't experience a power cut this time around, which there were quite a few of. It was every day there was a power cut when I was there in 2019. So that was a definite change. And I thought, I have a sense sometimes with Venezuela, it breaks all the rules of everything, right? Because it's almost like a revolution in slow motion. What you see is that part of what's held the anti-imperialist government in power for so long is the spirit and the things they've done for the masses and the loyalty the masses have for them, and that spirit of determination to not let the imperialists win is so strong. But also there has been this slow build-up of a kind of the beginnings of a parallel state machinery, which is not the bourgeois state and not under the control of the bourgeoisie. But it's almost like the situation when the Soviets were established in the Soviet Union, but you still had, the bourgeois state on one side and the Soviets on the other, and it's like a dual power situation. But it's like, in the Soviet Union, that dual power was like for a few months. And here we have a situation where it's been slowly building up the socialist state machinery, but for like 20 years, and that it's kind of looks like a stalemate. One side's not strong enough to beat the other, but very, very slow motion kind of dual power. So the things that I'm aware of that the Venezuelans have done, which are building up this kind of alternative base, is they have, first of all, they have the participatory democracy, which is, takes place at the very lowest level. They have local councils, which are made up of a group of, say, 300, 400 families. And then there's another layer on top of that, which is called the commune, where you bring together 2, 3, 4, 5 of those councils into a wider group. Then I haven't studied this in detail. It's all just things people told me, so I could be getting it wrong. But I think that they're in discussion about creating another layer above that, but it doesn't yet exist. But what does exist is a constituent assembly, which was specifically, I remember, looking into that when it was being inaugurated, specifically to counterpose, the problem of the bourgeois control of the National Assembly, which, as we know, how bourgeois electoralism works, you can elect loads of people into it, but you can't really get anything done. So they have these two assemblies now, and they basically physically face one another in the center of Caracas. And, they work according to quite different processes and agendas, one of which is a very participatory, reflect the will of the masses democracy. And the other one is your classic bourgeois democracy, reflect the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. So, and of course, the other really important thing they've done is to do with the armed forces. So after the 2002 coup, Chavez was able, and they already had a situation where a lot of the military was loyal to Chavez and to the masses, which is very unusual, and it's a particular kind of Venezuelan historical thing, which has always been a very important prop of the project, the Bolivarian project. It's not just through elections. They had a big chunk of the army all the way through. But from 2002, they worked to reshape the army completely and make it a people-aligned army. So that's been really, really important, because, of course, if the ruling class had control of the army, they would never stop trying to, run coups, and probably would have succeeded at one by now. But they lost control of the army, which, although they have the media and a lot of the economy, it very much neuters their ability to push back. Which is why you have this situation of ongoing polarization, in society, but not a bourgeois ability to take a kind of decisive pounce, as it were. They don't have the security forces. And besides the regular army, the Venezuelans have introduced people's militias. So the armed people is a real factor in defending the revolution. People's militias, ordinary workers in uniform taking part in being trained, holding arms, So again, a very important aspect of socialist revolution, the armed people, does exist. And so they have the ability to defend the revolution. And I think they based that on the Cuban Committees to Defend the Revolution, right? Which again, the Cuban revolution is defended by the armed people. They might not be walking around the streets with machine guns every day, but they're trained and able to bear arms when necessary. So they have that ability to defend their revolution, and the Venezuelans have that too. And again, it's something really lovely to be in a country where, when you see a squadron of young people in the street with uniforms and weapons, you feel friendly towards them, and you feel like they're friendly towards you. It's a very different feeling on the streets. I had the same feeling seeing policemen on the streets in Beijing. And it reminds me very much of the Chinese revolutionary storybooks I grew up with as a child, where, the People's Liberation Army cap was the sign of a friend. This difference between an armed force which represents a hostile class and an armed force which represents the popular class is really significant, I think.
Yes, and the establishment of these alternative structures, particularly the alternative democratic structures of the Venezuelan masses, and the involvement of the masses in the armed defense of their revolutionary process. Without that, then the imperialist plots would have succeeded, I think, in pushing aside the PSUV, because there's a clear strength of feeling within the masses that this is a process which is about them being able to have control over their country, their resources, their land, building it for them and their children and their descendants. And that's something which, of course, the imperialist press doesn't want anybody to know in this country. So if you look at the coverage of not just Venezuela, but any country which is either socialist or going through a revolutionary process, you would believe it's the antics of mad old Hugo Chavez and nobody else is involved, or it's just a bunch of guys in a palace somewhere plotting. Whereas the active and the ongoing engagement of the masses in the revolutionary process is something that not only just does not compute for most bourgeois journalists at all, they can't understand it. It's that they actively, I think, on some level, they know that if that was to be revealed, then their whole vision of that they are presenting to the populations in the imperialist countries of these non-imperialist countries, of these socialist countries, that'd all fall apart. Because if millions of people are dedicated to something, then, well, how do you explain that? So it really sort of punctures the mythology, doesn't it? That this is the work of a bunch of sort of like a military clique, which is something which even, some leftist groups in the West will perpetuate about Venezuela and other countries as well, won't they?
Definitely. And you've reminded me to talk to you about something really important that I saw when I was there, which is the local village committee and barrio commune plans. And there's something so beautiful and so inspiring and so empowering about the way the local councils and communes work. And I saw it at first hand in a couple of different barrios and neighborhoods. inside and to the outside of Caracas. And essentially what we saw was that in each important area of life, so it's health, it's transport, it's education, it's infrastructure, it's housing, the local committee, the lowest level, would have got together and had a meeting of all the families and decided in each area. So they have a bunch of areas of life, like I said, and then they will pick what they think is their top priority of a problem to solve in that area. And then they will say how they think they're going to solve it, who's in charge of making sure it's going to happen, that process, how long they think that's going to take. And then basically the communities are empowered to try to come together and try to solve problems that they've identified. Whether it's, the water pipes. I mean, one of the ones I saw on the wall, just off the top of my head, the water pipes in this barrio are a bit old and they need replacing, right? And that's something that they'd identified that they've got to sort out. And they've put they've worked out a plan for how they're going to do it, and they're doing it together. And of course, what they then do is, because we don't have a planned economy per se in Venezuela, you have a government that is able to allocate certain resources out of what it has to facilitate people. So, they'll go to the government and say, this is what we need. And if the government can provide it, it will. If it can't, they'll try and find another way, because obviously they appreciate that it's not the government not wanting to help them. The government tries to help them. It can't always give them what they need. And sometimes they have to look for other ways. And for example, they're doing a lot of talk about how to continue with the housing missions, some of which kind of ground to a halt of their building because they were building blocks in concrete. And there's no longer concrete available in Venezuela. So what do we do? And they're looking at what local materials can we use, what styles of building can we do. But a fascinating thing I saw in this same barrio that I visited on the outskirts, in the mountains outside Caracas, it's a very, very hilly area. The way, obviously they can't build big tower or housing blocks in an area like that because of the type of terrain it is. So what happens is the local community nominates the next person who needs a new house. And then that family, they're given a bit of land, and depending on how many are in the family, that's how big the bit of land is. And then they go to the government and say, right, I've got a bit of land this big. And the government provides them with materials. And then they build the house. And the Venezuelans are really proud of the fact that they've all become brilliant at all kinds of things. And I said, does the community build the house? They were like, well, if we ask for help, then our neighbors will come and help us. If there's something we can't do, or if we see like there's an old person who needs a house, they can't build it, we'll build it for them. But essentially, they're quite sort of proud of the kind of self-reliance of like, well, I've learned how to do it, so I do it myself. And I walked around a house that was in the process of being built by the couple who lived there. They had I think a teenage daughter. They were both school teachers, and they were, doing the building works in the evenings and the weekends outside of working hours. They were doing a really good job, right? But the materials had all, good quality materials. They'd come from the government. They'd been given the land. Now, what's really interesting about what's happening, and I must tell you this as well, what's happening in terms of keeping people alive despite the sanctions, is they've essentially got a kind of again, they don't have a planned economy. So they're fighting with effects of capitalist crisis and inflation. They're not in control of everything that's produced and exactly how it's distributed. So what they've got is basically a rationing system called, I think it's called Plan? I used to know it and I've forgotten it, just gone out of my mind, sorry. But anyway, so the housing that they're given, they don't pay rent. It belongs to the state, but they're not having to pay rent. They don't have to pay bills for the utilities there. They're given a ration of essential food items every week, or I think it's every week, some oil, some rice, some wheat, some pasta, a few kind of to get you by, basically. So despite the fact of the problems of embargo and inflation and all these other things that are sort of forced onto them, their salaries, which are nominally very small, don't have to cover any of those things that I just talked about. So they'll use their salary to cover, a few extra, nutritious bits like, you know, eggs, dairy, meat, maybe meat, not necessarily, you know. I mean, definitely, you know, the basic level of living for most people is low in terms of access to consumer goods and just the ability to buy, you know, enough food to give you good nutrition, but the government is keeping them alive and making sure that they have places to live and their utilities are paid for. They're not paying bills for their water, their electricity, their sewerage, any of that. That's all included in, like, here's a place to live. And so that's keeping people going. And it was really interesting for me, you know, particularly as a parent or someone who just in our Western society, and I see our fragmented, disillusioned kind of misery, although we're under piles of stuff, aren't we, on our side of the world? You know, we have this privileged kind of almost over access to consumer goods and, you know, bits and bobs of all kinds. And yet, what was really interesting was the spirit that I felt from the people who are living in these very difficult conditions was so strong and positive. You know, little kids were smiling and running around and playing outside and joining in with community events and growing up in a world where their opinion and their action matters, where they see their parents working together with all the aunts and uncles around them. I mean that in the community sense, not in the relation sense, right? The grandmas and the aunts and the uncles all around them, they're all working together and they're identifying problems and they're solving them together. And the kids are growing up watching that. And okay, they don't have loads of toys and computers and, you know, millions of books, but they have a sense of me, you know, they're surviving. They have a home, they have a shelter, they have a school, they have a sense of meaning, which I think is really absent from the lives of the kids who are growing up in the West, surrounded by consumer durables and computers and social media, but without a sense of community or focus or constructive activity. You know, their parents go to work in a very miserable sense and come home exhausted and stressed, and then, you know, do it all again. And, you know, that they get Nike trainers and they get the latest iPhone or the PlayStation and they, you know, play their games, but the sense of engagement and the development that gives to kids as they grow up, you know, the interaction, the engagement, the meaning, the kind of safety in their community that they have, actually, that I saw in the communities I went to, I think is really lacking for our kids here. And I had a conversation with a guy who's a really young mayor of a suburb just outside Caracas, and he has grown up his whole life in you know, as a Chavista, basically, because he's only about 30 and or even less, and, you know, so he doesn't really remember before Chavez, right? He's a product of this whole process, and now he's a mayor of his local area. And I was talking to him about this, you know, this difference in how the children seem, you know, to me, and what they have that you can't buy. And this is something I think that's so hard for people to understand, that there are things that matter in life which are social, and you can only get them by having the right type of society. You can't get them by buying things. There's no amount of money that can buy for your children the type of development environment you get from living in a people-centered society. You know, and you can identify it as a need, but you can't solve that as an individual living in a society that isn't structured that way. So that was something that I, you know, really, really noticed and kind of felt quite deeply. Just like I noticed, you know, when we went to one meeting at a commune, you know, before we sort of looked around, they put on a little meeting, and the lady who was conducting the meeting was obviously a kind of local leader, and she was what I would call an abuela. She was a working class grandma, right? But she was fiery, she was spirited, she was the boss of this meeting. I was listening in my, you know, not very good Spanish, doing my best, but my ears pricked up when I heard her say in Spanish these words of Marx. She said to us, "Theory becomes a material force when it grips the masses." And she herself was everything I was looking at was a perfect example of how true that is. And it was so beautiful to see someone like that say that and to recognize it. It jumped out at me straight away, even though my Spanish is terrible, that that's what she was saying. You know, this working class, you know, Venezuelan grandmother, you know, who lives so far away from, you know, and this is something that, you know, we say all the time in our study, in our paper, in our meetings, in our theoretical works, in our resolutions, you know, this importance of connecting the theory of Marxism with the working class and what power it has when you do that. And it really, you know, touched me to the heart to listen to this grandmother, you know, quoting Marx to that meeting.
Well, I think you pick up on something very important there, which is the difference between the world of things, which is the world that we exist in here, where you can have, if you can borrow enough money, an unlimited amount of commodities, more every week if you want to. But that is essentially, I would argue, a stand-in and a substitute for actual meaning and actual control over your life, the life and future of your family, your community, your entire nation. And that is what is distinctively, of course, lacking in the imperialist countries, which is why at root it's the root of the problem as to why there is so much alienation, why there is so much mental illness, why there is so much dependency on substances, substance abuse, etc. Because there's this massive void in most people's lives, be they very young or right the way up to being very old, where they feel like you are working for essentially nothing for yourself. You're working just to survive, which doesn't provide all the things that a human being actually requires. And it's one of the sort of slanders of Marxists that pro-capitalist commentators throw out, that, oh, well, you people don't believe in the spiritual. And I've always thought that, well, I wouldn't call it spiritual, but we know that the human being has an instinctive urge towards the social and towards building a better future which they can actually feel like have a sense of ownership in. And when you don't have that, you get people trying to fill that void with things and fill it with garbage culture, which is all that imperialist countries produce. And you contrast that with countries that are somewhat poorer in terms of their ability to obtain commodities, but where the people have a tremendous sense of optimism. There is no sense of optimism in Britain today, nor is there much of one in the United States anywhere, even amongst the ranks of the bourgeoisie themselves. They all know that there's a crisis, even if they're frantically trying to displace responsibility for it. So I think like the examples that you're giving are really important to bear in mind as to like, well, this is what this is what would come with a socialist society. It's a sense of purpose and direction and the removal of alienation from ourselves and the youth as well. And if you as a person look at this society and think, well, this society is sick, well, then the rational direction to move in is in the direction of studying scientific socialism and absorbing its lessons, because no capitalist ideology that is being offered under the current system, even if it purports to be critical of it, is going to lead towards that sense of shared purpose that it is revealed over and over again that human beings very much need.
Absolutely. And I just want to say a little caveat there, because, you know, we're accused of lots of things and lots of them are contradictory, but one of the things communists are accused of is wanting to make everybody poor and sort of almost glorifying mutual poverty, and we just want to bring everyone down to the lowest common denominator and keep them there. That's not what communism is. Communism is all about growth. It's all about raising up the standard of living of everybody together, rather than polarizing the standard of living so that lots of people are really poor while a few people are super rich. And, you know, the super rich have a class of mandarins around them who are having quite a nice time. But it is also true that fundamentally it's not the stuff that makes you happy, it's the meaning. And the meaning comes in a social context. You're absolutely right. And it's what gives you optimism for the future and for the life, and a sense of purpose. You know, one of the things that makes life feel good, and this is something that people even in the West are starting to identify, it's just so hard to do anything about, right? There's one of them is meaningful social interaction. They're identifying it as an important pillar of mental wellness, right? Go and fix that, everybody. Go and sort out your meaningful social interaction.
Yeah, well done, experts.
And the other one is meaningful, useful work. Again, all very well to say it, isn't it? And say, oh, okay, I need to make sure I got meaningful, useful work then. My argument is, I feel like I found it. I feel really lucky, right? But I decided a long time ago the meaningful, useful work I'm going to do is communist work, because the meaning for me is, building a movement that will take society forward out of, the insanity of decaying imperialist global catastrophe and forward into socialism. And to me, in the conditions we live in, that is meaningful, useful work. But, people need to feel that their work is meaningful and useful, and it's very soul destroying if they don't have that in their life. And I felt when I met the working class communities that I met in Venezuela very much that they had that sense of meaning, of collective purpose as well as individual purpose, that everybody knew what was the point of what they did and why they were doing it, and that changed how they felt about a lot of things. And what was very notable to me too was, lots of young people having children, not huge families in the kind of old school Catholic, you must just keep churning out babies, but in the positive embrace life, 1 or 2 children while you're quite young is a good idea. And it's nice to have children, right? And that's interesting to me, because very much I'm getting these days in Britain a sense from the younger generation, particularly sort of mid-20s and down, a sense that, well, why would you have children? Because what's the point? And you're just going to mess them up and they'll be miserable and there's no future. There's nothing worth, bringing them into the world for. And even that kind of eco-doomism of like, oh, well, there's too many people on the planet, as opposed to the kind of socialist approach, which again, I saw in Venezuela. They're very interested in the environment. They talk about eco-socialism. How can we build our houses and construct our society in a way that balances our needs with the needs of maintaining the environment? And they care about it. Of course they do. Who wouldn't? The point is they have an opportunity to make policies that will take those things into consideration and balance those things out. And build that into the way that they approach all of their problems. They're empowered to do that. They're not just victims of a system that lectures them, but gives them no ability to affect anything. And that makes them positive about the future, despite, all the challenges that they're facing.
Yes, and you mentioned something important there, which is like the difference between like eco-doom garbage that comes out of people like our beloved Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and every other talking head and politician on the television. The difference between that, which is this Malthusian madness, which they're giving out basically as it's a symptom of a system in decline. And they're casting about these ideologists of capital to try and find something which explains why things are going so badly. And they've seized upon this as the latest thing. That, and there's profit to be made in the green so-called solutions that they present, mainly involving tunneling into the countries like Congo and stealing all the rare earth metals from there to build electric cars and stuff like that. But there's a difference between that side of things and caring about your living environment and caring about your children having healthy water to drink, not despoiling the natural world, which is what a lot of socialist countries have pioneered approaches towards that and towards a healthy living environment for the future generations. And that's a big difference that I think communists in all countries, but particularly in the imperialist ones, need to take a clear stance on, which is that the Malthusian eco-doomer garbage that comes from the all of the NGOs and all of the governments, it's all about basically justifying decay and decline and profiteering ultimately. Whereas if you look at socialist countries and anti-imperialist countries, they are building systems or trying to build systems which actually do balance human need with the needs of the environment, and the two aren't separate. Human beings need a healthy living environment to thrive in, and the environment is central to the human world. We're not separate from it. There's not the human world and the environment. These are two things which are constantly interacting with each other. So, but that's been lost in the West in the way that this discourse is conducted. So it's no wonder you get now millions of workers looking at, various clowns on TV babbling about climate change, of which they understand little, and think, well, you're conning me, because in many ways they are. But the approach of countries like Venezuela can show us a different way to consider environmental questions, can't it?
Definitely, absolutely. And I guess that it just underlines the difference in approach to humanity, doesn't it? Because when you have a system like imperialism, which is in decline, in decay, in crisis, has too many people, too many workers than it knows what to do with, and they're just a problem to it, essentially, giving our young people the message that don't have babies, there's no point, like, is actually quite a useful one. And the enemy of humanity is humanity. The enemy of the planet is humanity, right? Resources are all getting used up and they'll run out. You know, these kind of doom-laden, miserable, nihilistic messages. You know, and actually they're propagating them really widely, because I hear my son, who is 11, you know, coming out with ideas along the lines of, the problem for nature, the problem for the planet is there's too many people and people behave badly, right? And it's in essence, it's people versus the environment is the kind of narrative we've been given to justify all kinds of agendas, right? Simultaneously, like you said, there's this marketing of green products which are totally anti-environment. I mean, you know, if you want to, for example, preserve resources and, you know, all this babble about recycling and reusing and all the rest of it, they're telling us to throw away cars that work, to buy electric cars, which are like glorified iPhones, right? They're a battery wrapped up in a hunk of metal, and their hope is that you'll throw it away in a few years when the battery stops working very well and buy a new one. What that has to do with saving the environment is anybody's guess, right? I mean, none of it, if you stop and take a look at it, none of that proposition makes any sense whatsoever. Of course, what we need is public transport. And, you know, if electric engines are needed to replace diesel and petrol engines, there's definitely a different way of doing that, a different model that would make more sense, right?
Yeah.
And they're not pursuing a model that makes sense for the environment. They're pursuing a model that makes sense for capitalism, and wrapping it up with all this greenwashing to guilt trip you into feeling you should throw away your car and bankrupt yourself on buying a brand new one. And these hold no value. Right? It's very hard to buy a second-hand electric car because they're basically useless after a few years, as far as I can work out. I don't think they've, you know, really sorted that out yet. You know, so the whole thing's insane. Now, interestingly, I mean, I've always been a bit cross that China has followed this model of, you know, electric cars as a solution to the climate problem, when, you know, buses and trams and metros would be a lot more useful, as far as I can see. But what I do notice they're doing in China and in other countries where they use Chinese technology is they have basically lots of people using little electric scooters. And when you go to recharge the battery of your scooter, they're all interchangeable, and you just swap it over with somebody. So rather than recharging, you give them your empty battery, they give you a full one, and off you go. Right. So the fact that they can slot them in and out of these, so it's been designed in a standardized way and in a way where you can slot them in and out. Well, that to me makes a whole lot more sense. Right? As if you're thinking about a model that makes sense for individually getting about and not messing with, you know, the pollution levels and all the rest of it. But, you know, still, I personally think that walking or cycling or living close to your work, you know, in a planned economy and not wasting your life commuting is a pretty good idea, and public transport for the rest of it.
Yeah, far superior methods, I think, there. Don't tell Jeremy Clarkson. I wanted to also address with you, Joti, the World Anti-imperialist Platform meeting that you obviously attended in Caracas. And it's interesting to see just how many representatives from various different organizations were there. It's a truly global coming together of these various different parties and organizations. Reading through the statement that was made by the conference at the end of it, it reflects a lot of very interesting things, including a view on US imperialism, which she sees it as a truly global and integrated system that needs to be fought on every level that you possibly can, including viewing things like the so-called international institutions like IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organization, and you can even throw in there the International Criminal Court, which is essentially an extension of US imperialism, even though they don't recognize it. So that seems a much more comprehensive view of imperialism that the WAP has developed there. than that which you would find in most of the left in the Anglosphere countries, and indeed most of the European nations as well. So I wondered if you could comment on the statement that was made and the conference that you attended, and what was the general mood coming out of that in terms of the comrades there analyzing the situation.
So are you talking there specifically about the Caracas Declaration?
Yes.
At the end, yeah, okay. So yeah, it was really interesting actually, because of course we were in Caracas and we were being kind of co-hosting with the PSUV. So there was a lot of discussion with the PSUV about the contents of that platform, of that statement. And of course it was focused in a big way on Latin America, but at the same time connecting in, as the platform has tried to do from the beginning, this understanding that, you know, and increasingly, you know, as the drive to war hots up, and as the war against Ukraine and the push of more and more hybrid efforts against China are ramping up, it's becoming much clearer for many people exactly what the split is in the world. And that's really why we formed the platform, that understanding, that clarity actually that it's bringing to people, and the clarity it's bringing to who's on whose side. You know, for a long time, there's been a lot of confusion in the communist movement and the left-wing movement. And, you know, particularly when it comes to international relations, it was almost quite difficult to work out who was useful to work with. And people had lots of differences on different things, and, you know, which ones really matter and which ones don't. It's not always clear to you, right? Oh, these people seem to be good at this type of thing, but they've got some funny ideas. These people seem to be good on this, but, you know, we would disagree on that. But we kind of try and work with people and have generally kind of friendly relations around the world. But this has brought a clarity to international left-wing, communist, Marxist, anti-imperialist thinking and activity in a way that nothing else could have, really. The obvious coalescence of all the imperialists behind US imperialism. You know, there's been times over the recent period where it looked like, you know, say maybe 20 years ago, it looked like the EU was trying to break out from under the shadow of the USA, and talking about having its own army, and it didn't go along with the war in Iraq, and there was real contradictions there. And there was a sense that there might be a rapprochement between Germany and Russia that could lead to a kind of, you know, super Eurasian power that would be able to, you know, come up against, in a real meaningful way, the USA. USA managed to prevent that from happening. It wasn't foregone conclusion that that would never happen, but it didn't turn out that way. And with the war against Ukraine and this realization, you know, Russia getting up off its knees and becoming an anti-imperialist, a firmly anti-imperialist power, having been, you know, on the fence for a while about where was its destiny and what was it going to do, and China having developed to the level where it can stand up now and say, no, this is who we are, and we're sick of you trying to push us around. We've tried everything to get along with you, but if you won't get along with us, well, we've got our ability to carve our own way, and we can and we will. And the US, you know, the economic crisis of the global imperialist system, you know, all feeding into this situation where the rulers of the US imperialism feel that they absolutely have to quickly take on Russia and China, and that they've mobilized the other imperialist powers behind them. So there's become this really clear divide in the world suddenly. These wars are connected. You know, the war against Russia and Ukraine, the moves towards war against Iran, against the DPRK, against China, they're all connected to this drive to try to restabilize the imperialist economic system by cutting out rivals, by finding new avenues of you know, new areas of the world to just loot unrestrainedly and you know, garner huge profits, and the need to, you know, to find some way to bring back growth into an economy that's totally glutted and stalled, and just sinking into crisis and exploding with inflation and all kinds of other problems. And of course, you know, the way that they've conducted these wars is actually backfiring and making their crisis worse. So we have this situation where the war in Ukraine has really brought the characteristics of the world we're living in into very sharp relief. And the process of the US building its camp over here and the anti-imperialist camp and response coming together over here has made, again, the contours of the world very clear. And it becomes very important then for communists to stand back and say, okay, well, the main question in the world today is the question of imperialism and anti-imperialism. Okay, the USA is putting everything and pulling behind it every last resource to try to crush all opposition to its hegemony and its ability to revitalize itself at the expense of the masses of the world, essentially, is what it wants to do, to save itself from this crisis of profitability, you know, this crisis of overproduction in which it's really mired, and it's enmeshed and mired in it so deeply because the number of times they've kicked the can down the road of this overproduction crisis, you know, is quite staggering, actually. The most recent one was the COVID crash. You know, they suddenly brought lockdowns in to hide the fact that they'd had a huge economic crash and they were bailing out the stock markets, and they didn't want us to know, so they told us they were bailing us out, right? And locked us all down while they did it, because that would make us believe it was a health crisis that they were responding to, but actually they were responding to a financial crisis. That's why they didn't respond earlier with any health measures when they would have been useful, right? They responded at the moment when the stock market needed their money, and that was really important. But so this constant kicking the can down the road, but of course since 2008 the main method by which they've kicked the can down the road has been printing money, and that's now coming back to bite them. And everything they do from now on, I mean, there's a new systemic banking crisis, you know, hovering over the world, and bits of exploding here and there, and then they're suppressing it and trying not to talk about it. And, you know, you just have to read the back page of the Financial Times to try and work out what's going on, you know. But again, how will they try to solve this problem? It's going to be more money printing. And, you know, so they're feeding the fire, constantly stoking the fire and creating this polarization. Sorry, I'm going way off topic, aren't I?
Roll with it, let's
context.
go.
I'll give in context. So, you know, there's a situation where they're putting everything into trying to hold on to, save the system, hold on to the current relations of production, and hold on to their position within that system, come out on top, come out, you know, benefit at the expense of everybody else underneath. And, you know, that the imperialists in Europe and Japan will put up with taking the brunt. This is what the US hopes, I think, because it's better than losing the whole pie. Right? You know, if the system remains, there's still going to be powerful British financiers out the other side of it. There'll still be powerful German financiers out the other side of it, even if the masses in Britain and Germany have been massively impoverished as a result. It's still the most important thing for them is to save the system, which is really failing right now. And it's not clear to the masses of people that is what's happening, that it's a crisis of overproduction, that the system is really floundering and failing in a systemic and serious way, and that the drive to war is about trying to save that. But that is what we're seeing. And so the primary contradiction in our world today is between this imperialist drive and all the forces that oppose it. No matter what kind of leadership those countries have, whether it's the Ayatollahs in Iran or the Workers' Party of Korea, the Chinese Communist Party, or you know, the party of the Russian Federation, I forget the name of them.
United Russia.
United Russia, that's right. Well, whoever it is and whatever ideology they espouse in their leadership, or Bolivarian Venezuela, or Communist Cuba, or Sandinista Nicaragua, right? Any country that is prepared to say no and join this increasing bloc that says we will defend our sovereignty and we will stand together to do it. And that's really important, that these countries are coming together and working together economically, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of technology transfer, and in terms of military cooperation. You know, and the Chinese have understood that this war against Russia is also aimed at them. You know, the imperialists, in their minds, you know, the strategists of the USA have this idea that if they can just get, you know, Russia carved up and out of the way, then China's weaker and easier to pick off, right? But they had the same view for the last 20 years when they were going through the Middle East. You know, Syria was supposed to be a stepping stone to Iran. You know, that didn't work out. Constantly they see, oh, if we can take this one down, then we'll take the next one down. And, you know, they have this idea, this plan, this long-term hope of you just destroying all the resistance if they can just get there in time. But they were supposed to have taken out all of the Middle East before they got round to Russia and China, right? And what's actually happened? What has actually happened is they didn't win in the Middle East. Now they've turned their attention to Russia. And with their attention elsewhere, what's happening in the Middle East?
Their influence is falling apart.
China and Russia have come in as the new partners of choice, and the USA is losing its dominance in the Middle East for the first time since the Suez Crisis. It's phenomenal, and it's happening so quickly. You know, and actually it's the war in Ukraine which has totally accelerated that process, and the demands of the imperialists. You know, when they're in trouble, they demand that all of their lackeys just subordinate all their interests to them. And there's China and Russia, they're going, we could help you do it differently if you like. And all kinds of very unexpected people are going, well, maybe we would like to do it differently. Maybe my government won't survive if I just subordinate all of our country's interests to the USA, because the people won't necessarily wear it. You know? So the total backfiring. But anyway, as far as the platform is concerned, this is the vital, the crucial question of our time. And more people are understanding that that is the case. And it becomes very important to bring that message to the masses everywhere. Not only it's the crucial question, but we have to take a side, because it really, really, really matters to us who wins. Not in a little emotional way, not in a, oh, I would like it, wouldn't it be nice? But just think what will happen to the world if the imperialists win against Russia and China. I mean, again, essentially that means against the masses of the world, doesn't it? And what it means is, you know, that imperialism will get a huge shot in the arm to loot, to restabilize itself at the expense of the masses, who will be even poorer coming out the other side of it, and will stay poorer while the imperialists, you know, are looting and sucking up even more of the world's wealth towards themselves. And, you know, we'll be having to reboot our struggle from the base all over again in 20 years' time, after the world has suffered, you know, stupendous, horrendous losses. I mean, it genuinely doesn't bear thinking about. And to me is why this question, it demands us to understand, number one, it's the fundamental contradiction in the world. Number two, we have a side. And number three, we've got to do what we can to make our side as strong as possible, right? It's not academic, it's not theoretical. Yes, we have theory that backs up our understanding and shows us which way to act, but then we must act. And this is really the goal that Platform has set itself, is really to help to clarify this understanding for our movement, which has been so full of so much mushy and muddiness for so long, that now there's a question around which we must have total clarity and very clearly pick our side. And then once we're on that side, work together.
Well, yes, I'm guessing the Stop the War Coalition online petition won't be stopping anything anytime soon. But this has been a really interesting and useful discussion, Joti. It certainly, I think the audience will learn a lot specifically about the ongoing revolutionary process in Venezuela and the importance of us understanding it and realizing that the working class here has a real material interest in the success of these projects to build alternatives to imperialism, alternatives to the capitalist system all the way around the world. So I think that that's a vital thing that we need to take out to the masses in our own nation. But if people want to learn more about the platform, where can they go to?
So the platform has a website. It's wap21.org, WAP21.org. And you can see all kinds of speeches, videos, documents on there. We're shortly going to be launching, I think, a news site as well. So I'll keep you updated when that happens. I would also ask people to follow me, Joti Brar, and also my party, the Communists, on Telegram. That's my favorite social media. You get the information without all of the dross. Yes,
it's much easier to filter out the garbage. All right, well, Joti Brar, thank you for coming on today for a really interesting discussion, and we'll be posting this episode up very soon, but thank you for your time today.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for having me.